Evening Year 11 and welcome to your night before news for paper 2, which is Superpower Relations and the Cold War. Just to remind you, your paper tomorrow will be 55 minutes long. That gives you 5 minutes of reading time to make sure that you've understood the questions and then 50 minutes to write. If you have a look at the screen, we can break it down into how much time you should spend on each question. So for the explain 2 consequences of question, which is worth 8 marks, you should spend 10 minutes, so 5 minutes on each consequence. Question 2, write a narrative account. You should spend 15 minutes on that question. It's worth 8 marks. And then question 3, you'll have 2 questions to answer. They are explain the importance of questions. They are worth 8 marks each, 16 in total, and you should spend 25 minutes on those questions. So your paper is worth 32 marks in total. That's 50 minutes of writing time and 5 minutes of reading time. What you can see in front of you is your topic list. So that means the topics that are definitely going to come up in the paper tomorrow. I'm not tricking you. These are the topics that are coming up. There will be nothing on the paper tomorrow that is not on this particular list, as well as the 2 topics on the next slide. This document can be found on Arbor. So if you log into Arbor and you open up the document that says Cold War Revision, you'll see this document. So you've got your topic, your specific factual detail, so that information about the topic, some resources to support your revision for further reading. So you've got a link to your online revision guide, which remember you will all have access to. You just need to type in your school email address and the password that you've created. And then you have a list of possible exam questions that you can practice this evening. Final 2 topics that will come up will be Czechoslovakia in 1968 and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. So my top tips for you this evening are to look, cover, write, check your facts, and there's a supporting document on Arbor to help you do that. Have your family and your friends quiz you on this so that you can make sure that you've got that basis, that foundation before you start your exam tomorrow. So the first question that you'll have tomorrow is a consequences of question, and we can see on the screen in front of you, it will be phrased, explain 2 consequences of a particular event. So in this case, we've got explain 2 consequences of the election of Alexander Dubček as leader of Czechoslovakia. So we need to just make sure that we've understood what the word consequences means. Consequence is something that happens because of an event, so after an event. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, it can be a positive thing as well. So your question will have 2 parts. Explain 2 consequences, in other words, explain what happens because of, and in this case, the election of Alexander Dubček, so that's our event. So explain what happens because of the election of Alexander Dubček as leader of Czechoslovakia. It's worth, when you open up your paper, making sure that you highlight the word consequences and perhaps write the word after above it so that you know that that's what it means, and also making sure that you've understood and therefore underlined the event that you are being asked to write about. So as I've already said, when we have this question, we need to think about consequences as being what happens after an event, what happens because of an event, and why. So our event in this case is the election of Alexander Dubček as leader of Czechoslovakia. If we have a look on your screen, there are a bullet point list of all the things that maybe we might think of when we think of Czechoslovakia in the Cold War. So we know it's a satellite state, it's communist, it was controlled by the Soviet Union, there was unrest there in 1968, Dubček became leader, he believed in socialism with a human face, which means communism but in a way that did not punish the people. He introduced some changes, some reforms, the Prague Spring reforms, which were introduced in April of 1968. We know that Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was a bit concerned about these reforms because there was more freedom. We know that Dubček met the leader of Yugoslavia and that worried Brezhnev. We know that Dubček did not threaten to leave the Warsaw Pact, but we also know that he wouldn't end reforms. So the Soviets then invaded Czechoslovakia in August of 1968. Dubček was arrested, replaced with Husak, a hardline communist. The Prague Spring reforms were ended. We then know that the Brezhnev Doctrine was introduced and that the Soviet Union strengthened control over the communist satellite states like Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland. We know that after this event, the USA appeared to be weak because no military support was sent to support Dubček, and we know that some communist parties in other countries broke relations with the Soviet Union because they did not agree with the Soviet invasion. But not all of these facts are consequences, because they don't happen because of the election of Alexander Dubček. They don't happen after the election of Alexander Dubček. So let's have a look at what events would be consequences and what events actually would not be. So as you can see, our events at the top are in red. So these are the events that took place either before the election of Alexander Dubček, or they're not a consequence of his election. They didn't happen because he was elected. Those events in green, or those facts in green, are the things that happened because of the election of Alexander Dubček as leader. So because of his election, reforms were introduced. If he hadn't been elected or he hadn't been chosen, then those reforms would not have been introduced. Because of the election of Alexander Dubček as leader of Czechoslovakia, we know that a Soviet invasion took place to bring it back under control. Because of the election of Alexander Dubček, the Prague Spring reforms were introduced, which threatened Brezhnev, which meant the Brezhnev Doctrine was introduced. So when you are approaching this question, be very careful to think about not just describing the event, but thinking about what happened because of the event, what happened after the event, what did the event cause. The second question is a narrative account. So you will be asked to write a narrative account analysing a particular event or a particular period of time in the Cold War, and you'll be given 2 bullet points that you may use to support your answer. You do not have to use those bullet points, so if you don't understand both of them or one of them, you can ignore it, but they might just help you. So if we look at the example that you've been given on the screen, this says write a narrative account analysing the development of the Cold War 1947 to 49. You may use the following in your answer: the Truman Doctrine and NATO. So you are going to make sure that you underline the event or the time period that you are being asked to write about. And in this case, you're being asked to write about the development of the Cold War from 1947 to 49. So you want to make sure that the events you include in your answer fall into that time period. Now you've been given 2 bullet points there, which are the Truman Doctrine and NATO, so they might be able to help you. Once you've done that, it would be worth making a list of possible events that you think you could write about in your narrative account before you start to respond. So in this case, as you can see, we've got a list of events that took place between 47 and 49. So Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, Cominform, the Berlin Blockade, the Berlin Airlift, the division of Germany and the creation of NATO, and Comecon. Now you then need to think, what would the most appropriate events be? So which events link together? So in this case, the Truman Doctrine is a good place to start, and the Marshall Plan, followed by Cominform, which links really nicely to Comecon, because Comecon was created in response really to the impact of the Marshall Plan. So I've selected 3 events, and it will be a minimum of 3 that I can link together in that time period that really help to explain the development of the Cold War. Students often struggle with how they open up their narrative account, because unlike other questions, it's very difficult to rearrange the words of the question into the first sentence. So top tip for you, if your narrative account question has 2 dates in it, start with the earliest date, start with the earliest year. So in this case, it would be in 1947. If you're not sure, or if it doesn't have 2 dates in your question, and it just looks at 1 year, you could write to start with, or in the beginning, and that leads into the event that you want to talk about first. So let's look at how we would develop that further. So you start with our in whichever year is earliest, or at the beginning. So in this case, in 1947, the Truman Doctrine was introduced by the American President Truman. The doctrine stated that the USA would provide support to any country that would take a stand against communism. Truman wanted to use the doctrine to contain communism. So you begin with your year, and then you're going to write information about what happened in that year or at the beginning. So we have a point here. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine was introduced by the American President Truman, and we're then supporting that with additional knowledge. So we've started our narrative, we've got the beginning section. We then need to show how that event, in this case the Truman Doctrine, would lead to another event, because if we can write how one event leads to another event, or how one event causes another event to happen, we are analysing that period of time, and that's what's going to get us our marks. So we then need to write about our linking, and useful phrases here are this led to, or as a result, or consequently, but let's pick this led to. So we've written about the Truman Doctrine already. That's our first event. We've got our point and supporting information, and we're then going to link it to the next event, in this case the Marshall Plan. So we're going to write this led to the announcement of the Marshall Plan, which provided Marshall aid to European countries to help them rebuild after the war. And then we're going to explain that even further. So we're going to explain how the Marshall Plan links to those ideas in the Truman Doctrine. So we've got the Marshall Plan helped to contain communism because it was thought that countries that accepted Marshall aid and became stronger would be less likely to turn to communism. This would mean that communism would not spread across Europe. So what we've done there, we've got our events in chronological order. We've put the earliest one first, which is the Truman Doctrine, and we've then brought in the Marshall Plan. And we've linked the two together by writing this led to, and we've explained and shown how they link together. We then want another event, because ideally we're looking for 3. So again, we're going to link our second event to our next event, and we're going to do that with our phrase as a result. So in this case, as a result of the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, Stalin introduced Cominform. So we've made that link really clear, and now we're going to show how they are linked. So Stalin introduced this because he felt threatened by the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. He felt that the USA was trying to create an empire, and so he needed to increase control over Eastern European countries. Cominform would allow him to do this. So we've made it very clear that Cominform happened because of the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, and in doing that we've linked our 3 events together. So just to recap, you get your question, you underline your time period or your event, you then write down what happened, you bullet point your list of things that happened either between the 2 years or within the year that you're given. You choose a minimum of 3 events that you think work together, that link together, and you start with your earliest and you end with your latest. And to show that you're linking together, you're going to use the phrases as a result of this, or this led to, and then you're going to explain how they led to, or why they led to, why they work together. So question 3 is an explain the importance of. You're going to be given 3 choices, and you're going to have to choose 2 of them in your time. So this question is asking you to explain why an event is important, which is in yellow, you can see on your screen, for a situation. So you're not just being asked why an event's important, you're being asked why an event is important for a particular situation. So if we look here, we've got why are the events in Hungary important for the development of the Cold War? Why is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan important for Cold War relations? And why is the Berlin crisis important for the development of the Cold War? To be able to answer this question, we need to think really about what the word important means in history and why an event might be important for a situation. Well, it might make a situation better. So it might actually make the Cold War less tense, for example. It might make a situation worse. It might increase tension. It might decrease tension. It might change the reputation of a superpower in some way. It might lead to another important event. It might increase a superpower control. It might decrease a superpower control. It might be important because it's really symbolic of the division that was experienced in the Cold War. So if you can think about why an event might be important for that situation, it will help you when you come to write a response. So when we're answering this question, we want to make sure that we're rearranging the words of the question into our answer, because then what we're doing is showing the examiner we've really thought about the question and we're not just describing everything we know about a particular event. So if we take that first example of explain events in Hungary for the development, explain the importance of the events in Hungary for the development of the Cold War, we're going to want to start with, well, the events in Hungary was important for the development of the Cold War because, and instantly in doing that, we are going to gain more marks. What we then want to do is give examples of why it's important, and we're going to introduce our evidence, and we'll show you how to do that in just a moment. And then we're going to explain why it's important, and we're going to show that by using the phrase, this means that. So on the screen, you can see an example of how we might respond to the first question. Explain the importance of the events in Hungary for the development of the Cold War. And what we've done is listed 4 events that took place in Hungary. Now, if you describe the events in Hungary, you would get 1, maybe 2 marks. But what we're looking to do is to think about why they were important. So ask yourself these questions. Did the events in Hungary increase Cold War tension? Did they decrease Cold War tension? Did they change the reputation of the USA? Did they change the reputation of the Soviet Union? Did they increase or decrease Soviet control of Eastern Europe? So actually, when we get down to it, events in Hungary were important for the development of the Cold War because they made the Soviet Union appear to be very, very strong. Because as a consequence of the Soviet invasion, Hungary did not leave the Warsaw Pact. Hungary remained communist, and other satellite states were unlikely to challenge the Soviet Union because they were worried. So it's thinking about what happened afterwards and how did things change as a consequence of that event. So Year 11, what I would do now, I would go and I would log on to Arbor, have a look at the events that are going to come up, have a look at the exam questions that you could practice and create plans for those. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to talk to a member of the history team before the exam in the morning.